Well, welcome and thank you for joining us at the 19th Capital Connection Conference. This year's conference features 14 outstanding presentations and more than 50 industry leaders who will be joining us over the 2 days. My name is Mike Fenton. I'm the President and CEO of ACG Toronto, and I want to welcome you to one of our 6 keynote presentations. On behalf of our conference co-chairs, Deborah Dobson of Peloton Capital Management, and Sean McKinnon, who's head of business development at NovaCap, I want to thank you for participating at Canada's largest event for the mid-market private equity and M&A sectors. Our conference theme this year is the Roaring 20s, winning with agility in private equity and M&A. The M&A sector has been exploding and expanding rapidly over the past 2 years, despite the unusual virtual world we've been working in. And currently, there's a record amount of dry powder funds available to be deployed, and many of our industry members have experienced strong results over the past year. The Association for Corporate Growth is the leading private equity and M&A industry in North America, covering the mid-market investment sector. We have more than 15,000 members, and we represent 52 cities in North America. And we generally host about 1,000 events a year. And then we're looking forward to moving back to a live environment to be hosting most of those in person versus online, which we've been doing for the last 2 years. In Canada, we have 5 chapters. Here in Toronto, we're celebrating our 50th anniversary. And then we have chapters in Vancouver, Edmonton, Calgary, and our new chapter, which launched in 2020 in Quebec. The ACG network is industry agnostic. Our members invest in every market sector, so we're interested in everybody's business. The membership covers all sectors of the mid-market ecosystem, including advisors, leading law firms, accounting firms, advisory shops, and investment banks, as well as specialty consultants. And then, of course, we work with our other group of members from the capital market sector, including the M&A groups and commercial finance teams from all of the major banks, private equity firms, and a growing number of family offices and corporate founders who are getting into direct investing. This year, the conference, as you probably know, since we transitioned to online, it's a different kind of production. And it's the second year that we've hosted online. We really appreciate the ongoing support of our ACG members who have both sponsored and, more importantly, provided some fantastic content. We want to recognize our sponsors who have been supporting us this year. In particular, our 3 platinum sponsors, BMO, RSM Canada, and the Globe and Mail, who have been part of this conference for the last 3 years. We're also very fortunate to have numerous sponsors at the gold and silver level, many of whom you'll be seeing throughout the conference in terms of speaking and presentation roles. I want to thank them all for their support. We could not have hosted this conference without them. And on behalf of our ACG conference committee, we appreciate their support. I will tell you that ACG Toronto normally hosts about 35 to 40 programs a year, focused around thought leadership, professional development, and of course, business development and deal flow. We're working on our 2022 program calendar right now, and I can tell you we're all looking forward to returning to live events in the new year. And now, would like to introduce our speakers and our presentation for today. Our topic is, can you afford to have a former rock star in your post-M&A deal? Kind of an interesting topic, but one I think you're going to find is extremely relevant to where we've been and, more importantly, where we're going. Our moderator today is Alan Litwack, who's a partner at Dickinson Wright, and our keynote speaker is Jennifer Fondrevay, who's a principal at Day One Ready Consultants, and our presenting sponsor is Dickinson Wright as well. So first, a few words about Alan. Alan, his practice is devoted to corporate commercial matters, including mergers and acquisitions, securities, and capital markets. His industry sector experience covers a variety of areas, including high-tech, telecom, retail, clean tech, environmental, manufacturing, real estate, cannabis, renewable energy projects, business services, and professional service firms. And he's also a keen golfer. Alan and I have had some interesting chats about golf over the years. In terms of Dickinson Wright, they have been a really strong supporter of ACG Toronto, but in fact, they're strong supporters of ACG throughout North America. They're continuing to be a growing full-service law firm of close to 500 diverse legal professionals, representing more than 40 practice areas, and they have been operating for, and I can't believe this, over 140 years. They represent Fortune 500 companies right down to small and emerging businesses, not-for-profits, and individuals. So we thank them for their support. And we'd like to welcome back Jennifer Fondrevay. Jennifer was our keynote speaker way back in the early days of the online virtual conference world. In fact, she was our keynote speaker at our Deal Source North conference in June of 2020, when we were just getting used to what this online environment was like. So we're really pleased to have her back. Today's topic is going to cover discussion around high-performing companies who have rock stars across the organization. They generally could be considered critical talent when determining a business valuation. The challenge is that rock stars can stumble when the metrics for success suddenly change, and we all know that they have changed across every industry and globally. These volatile times have upended our metrics for success, and that gets compounded when companies embark on doing M&A deals. When companies are integrating in those critical post-deal months, rock stars cannot afford to stay stuck in the old way of doing things. So Jennifer has guided companies over the years and their rock stars through the disruptive changes of a merger or an acquisition to achieve post-deal success. So in this discussion today, Alan and Jennifer are going to discuss the critical steps they need to help those rock stars and their teams stay performing at their best and shining in those critical months around the post-deal environment. And I would remind everyone on the broadcast today to post your questions in the chat box. Alan and Jennifer will be happy to answer them when they have time. So I'm going to welcome Jennifer and Alan. And Alan, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Thanks a lot, Mike. I'm very excited about this. In my 40+ years of doing M&A deals, one of the things I have learned from other people's unfortunate experience, and I've tried to make sure that where the target company has rock stars, that somebody approaches them long before closing, and generally as soon as they're likely to find out about the deal, because otherwise they may feel insecure. No one's coming to talk to them. They don't know, is it going to be better or worse after? Is their job even safe? And they become very susceptible to competitors calling them up and poaching them. And I've had this a number of times. A competitor calls and says, you know, the company you work for is in play. Has anyone come to you to assure you your job's going to be there post-closing? And what unfortunately can happen if you don't deal with this problem is that you close the deal and your rock stars are either gone already or on their way out the door. And to the extent that they're a valuable commodity, your target is now worth less than you paid for it, or you otherwise have problems. But my focus as a simple lawyer has been dealing with making sure they're there when the deal closes. Before I met Jennifer, I never thought about, well, we keep them, but how do we make sure they're still rock stars, that they're still valuable commodities? So for me, I'm ecstatic to be at this program with an expert on the part of the deal I never thought about before. And I certainly have no ability to advise a client how to deal with keeping them as rock stars. So Jennifer, I'm very much looking forward to this. I suspect that many people that are participating have read your article, or certainly will by the time we finish this. But what got you what was your reason for writing the article in Fast Company that has been incredibly well received? I understand there's something like 100,000 views on LinkedIn. You know, what made you think, first of all, that there was a need for this type of expertise and advice? And then what prompted you to write the article? And why do you think what you've done has struck such a significant chord with so many people?
I think there's a couple of reasons, Alan, but first let me say, you said you're a simple lawyer. I'm married to a lawyer. No lawyers are just simple. All lawyers have an opinion, and a valid one, and I'm thankful for that because I'm married to one. So I would be the first to confess that the fact that the article took off was a surprise, but I'm thankful. I co-authored that Fast Company article with another woman who is a sales leader. And she and I were talking about what we were seeing in our respective industries. In my case, in mergers and acquisitions, I frequently was seeing rock star performers stumbling after the deal had been announced and in that post-integration, because the metrics to change. They change almost overnight. And you can have a rock star who can't pivot with those changes, right? Who's stuck, who's done very well in those past success metrics, but can't pivot and move. And Amy, as a sales leader, saw salespeople in particular have that same type of issue where the company starts to go in another direction. They're used to doing sales one way and they flounder. And we both believe, we've got our theories, but we both believe that the article resonated so much right now because, as Mike highlighted at the beginning, all companies are having their metrics changed in multiple ways, right? You had alcohol companies suddenly making hand sanitizer. You had manufacturing companies suddenly making respirators. I mean, the pivots were significant. And when you've got a rock star who's really used to doing well against a certain set of metrics, if they can't pivot, they will have issues in the short term. So we wanted to write an article that addressed that help those individuals see, here's how to do it. Here's how to pivot. Here's how to be smart and how to think in the long term. I think the other reason, again, on theory, I think so many people see themselves as rock stars, right? So they read the article and said, this is me. I'm a rock star. I want to stay on top, which is wonderful, right? That's what you ultimately would want to have. So she and I both brought our expertise to it. And I now see, as deals have just, we're hitting record numbers, it's relevant to the discussion that we're having now about what do we do in that M&A space when we've got rock stars that we don't want to lose, or we don't want people who were rock stars to suddenly fall apart.
So one question I probably should have asked you initially, but it'll be a good then segue into how we deal with these things, is how do you define a rock star?
So, and it's important. We talk about a rock star from the standpoint, and I talk about it both as an individual, but rock stars, you can have rock star teams. But first, let's talk about just rock star individuals. It can be that person, I'm sure, Alan, you've experienced, right? It's the person who has the golden touch, right? It would appear that they can do no wrong. They often have the ear of the CEO. This could be the head of sales, as I mentioned earlier, but it could also be your product guru, your IT genius, the marketing savant, right? We all have terms for them, but they're the people who just, you feel like, wow, they've completely changed the trajectory of the company. They may have contributed even to the best practices of the company. And it can also be up and comers, right? So not only is it people across an organization, but it's at multiple levels, right? You can have someone who you say, that's an up and comer. He or she is going to have a mark at the company. So that's how we define rock star individuals. But teams can also be rock star teams. You can have teams in a company where it just feels like they're the high performing team. Everyone wants to be on that team. You hand them a challenge, they overcome it. Those are both the individuals and those teams. That's what you tend to focus on in that initial, the deal discussions, right? Who are the people we want to keep? What are the teams we need to keep happy? And that's why it's important to have a level set on, okay, who's a rock star? What is a rock star? And how do we mind them? But also, as the metrics change, how do we help them stay top performing?
So part of your analysis initially is it an individual or is it a team that we're dealing with?
Well, the area that I focus on, Alan, with when I'm guiding CEOs or private equity is the individual, right? But just always acknowledging that teams right now, in particular, that's what's making companies successful. It's what's the collaboration, the capabilities of the team. And as you've seen in that post-integration time, teams need to be able to collaborate. So you've got to be able to be conscious of your rock star individuals, but equally think of the impact of the rock star team. And that's what, that's what I'm sure we'll get into, but I want to make sure we made the distinction of there's two aspects of rock star.
So from your perspective and experience, how do you see rock stars helping a deal? How do you see them hurting a deal? What do the deal makers, whether it's the lawyers, the clients, the iBankers, the people doing the due diligence, what do they have to be concerned with? What should they be looking at?
Well, I think they can hurt the deal in that, and it kind of, you referred to it, if your focus and fixation is on these certain people right at the beginning, what I have seen repeatedly, and then my research proved out, is you can exhaust a lot of time and energy focused on certain people. You think, oh my gosh, if you lose Joe, I'll give him a name. If you lose Joe, you know, we're gonna lose all these customers. But what we see repeatedly happen is when the metrics for success change, new rock stars can rise, new people can be contributors, and you've spent all of your energy focused on an individual or a team. When the metrics have changed, new people can rise and say, I've got this. I see an opportunity. So I say in one regard, it's because the energy is focused on holding them. And I had, particularly with private equity interviews that I did for my book, repeatedly, they would say to me, we exhausted ourselves holding on to someone. They almost held us hostage, and it actually undermined the success of the deal. Because we spent so much time doing that, it stalled our efforts to get things moving. So I'd say in that regard, it can be detrimental to the deal. The other aspect in terms of looking at the individual is often someone who's been a rock star in the old way of doing things tends to be more obstinate, right? Holds back, says, this isn't going to be successful, particularly to the point you raised before. If they feel that they weren't aware of the deal happening, now suddenly what they see was what made them successful can come into question. And they can get frustrated and actually obstinate, and frankly can be, I don't want to say toxic, but can have a negative effect on other people's willingness to embrace the deal and the fact that a new way, a new strategy needs to be employed. So I think really from those two vantage points, it's important to be aware of how a rock star can become a former rock star, and to be mindful of that behavior. And that's why, frankly, my focus in the book and the consulting I do is not only to help business owners identify, who are your rock stars who may struggle, but then also what do you need to do to help them be a key contributor moving forward.
So I guess part of what you have to do is figure out who might be detrimental and how you're going to deal with it.
Yeah, because and when I say, there's clearly in the transaction timeframe, right? The due diligence, I completely understand that the focus is on getting the deal done. But I highlight that if you aren't thinking about the people piece, and the people piece isn't just who are the people that we need to retain, but be conscious and aware of the fact that you are going to be changing the metrics. What that company did is now going to change by nature, whether it's a merger, an acquisition, you're acquiring them, things are changing. And those new metrics are going to be new for both your rock stars as well as the rest of the workforce. Certain people will rise. Others may have difficulty. So it's more my first, point of reference is you just need to be aware of that and clear that in those beginning stages, the people who you counted on to be your talent, it's not a slam dunk, right? So that's the first point of reference. And then again, additionally, CEOs have repeatedly said to me, you're right. We had people who I hadn't anticipated stepped up. Right. And we use the pandemic as it's a master class in what happens when people are faced with change and changing metrics. Right. I maybe, Alan, you had this experience as well.
The one that comes to mind as you're speaking is, and I've seen this a number of times, you have a high tech company where you have two sets of rock stars. You have the tech people that develop the product and the salespeople who now have to commercialize it and monetize it.
Right.
And sometimes they have very conflicting, the engineering side of it, they want to invent the Rolls Royce of a product. And the marketing people don't necessarily need a Rolls Royce. They need something that is priced where it can be sold. And so you get two conflicting groups of rock stars. So is that the type of thing you're talking about?
Absolutely. One of the gentlemen I interviewed, there's his story in the book as well. You know, he said it was private equity. We were fixated on the founders. They were brothers, for it was cybersecurity. And he said, you know, we thought initially that they were the key, they were the critical piece. He said, but fortunately, we realized it was actually the developer who was, you know, back in a small room, you know, with the lights off. And he said, thankfully, we recognized that the real genius was the guy who, frankly, was probably the lowest paid, but who had the vision and the intellectual capital to really understand how to make this successful. And so, you know, that's just a perfect example of, it's not necessarily the people who are the loudest or in front of you. You need to anticipate that the rock star can be someone, you know, who plays maybe a secondary role in the company when you're first observing them, but can play a larger role. And then, you know, to your point, the people who are considered rock stars, who can falter, right? Who stumble when now things aren't fluid, and things have changed.
In your Fast Company article, you had 5 strategies for people to be able to remain as rock stars: solicit an outside perspective, assess your skills against the evolving needs of the company, stay market forward, practice agility, and be a role model for the organization. Can you walk us through these strategies?
I can, and I want to, and I think, Alan, we can talk through, because I'm confident you've got some thoughts on this as well. I want to frame it from the standpoint, because that article was written for the individual, right? The person who we wanted to reach with that piece was someone who maybe realized, I'm having a hard time pivoting. I feel like I'm not on top like I used to be. So we wrote it for that person. For deal makers who will be listening in, when we talk about solicit an outside perspective, because what can happen is you might have someone who's the head of sales, who's just phenomenal, does a great job. Let's say they actually sell a product. But then in an M&A scenario, in that post-integration, now they have to sell a solution, right? And that pivot from selling a tangible product to now it's a service or solution. And I will tell you, in my first acquisition experience, when Navtech was acquired by Nokia, that was the pivot, right? You're going from selling just digital map data to solutions for car, for phone, for enterprise. And so your rock star, if they haven't been getting outside perspective, you know, what we counsel is get a trusted advisors. You need that outside perspective, because just because you've been doing well in your company, the industry is changing. You need to be smart on what's happening in the industry and how it's evolving. So a rock star can start to believe their own chorus. And if they've done that, they can really stumble in an M&A scenario. So we talk about having trusted advisors, because routines can become ruts. And if you don't have an outside perspective, someone who you respect to give you, you know, their opinion, to say, listen, here's what's happening in the industry. If you continue to just beat the drum the same way, you could have a challenge as you move forward. And, you know, given the record-breaking number of deals that are happening, it's no longer a matter of if a deal will happen, it's when. So soliciting an outside perspective is key.
This may be a little bit out of the left field, but as you're speaking, a situation came to mind a number of years ago where we had a client, and they were a Canadian retailer. And they had some rock stars who had put their computer programs and systems together. They had systems that for their industry, nobody else had. And they were taken over by a global retailer who wanted to come to Canada, and did as a result. And our clients, rock stars, had created this computer program that was 10 times better than what the global retailer
Yeah.
had. But for whatever reason, the rock stars weren't able to explain that. And what happened was the global retailer shut down this incredible computer system. Now, our theory, you know, from the outside was their IT people didn't want their employer, knowing that this much smaller group in Canada had developed a much better system than them. So they needed to get it shut down as quickly as they could before the Canadian people took their jobs. But
Right.
what should the Canadian rock stars have done?
Well, and you bring up an excellent point, Alan, because that scenario, that happens repeatedly. I mean, I interviewed probably 60 plus executives, private equity CEOs, CFOs for my book. And I have so many stories like that. And the reality is, particularly for deal makers who are listening in, you need to be aware, because oftentimes there's the corporate, right? The as you talked about, like the larger company that acquires that smaller startup. They acquire them for that nimble nature and for their ability to have a product that moves quickly. But people can stay stuck in their old way of doing things, and certainly don't want to be confronted with the fact that they're outdated, despite the fact that the deal was actually supposed to help them ramp up. And so for deal makers, it's critically important to recognize we need to make sure that the best solution is what's delivered to the market, that the focus is on the client and what is best for the client, not, simply the acquirer winning out and being the dominator of here's what we're going to move forward with. It's got to be what's best for the client. So when I say solicit outside perspective, I say even for deal makers, you need to be aware of I would say greasing the pipeline so that it's understood. It's going to be what's best for the client. It's best practices from both, and not necessarily who was the acquirer. Because oftentimes, and I had CEOs share that with me, they said our arrogance got in the way and it undermined our ability to really have the team that had the better product move forward with it.
Maybe that leads to maybe you could focus a little more on the part of how do you become a role model for the organization?
Well, and it's, that was our fifth point, Alan, in the 5 strategies. And when I've been asked, of these 5 strategies, what do you think is the most critical? That is it. That being a role model for the organization, because it's important to keep an outside perspective, right? To be agile, to stay market forward and have that ability to pivot. All of those are critical. The reason why I say because I suspect you've had this experience as well. Once someone who's been a rock star, but then struggles and has some issues, once they realize though that the metrics have changed and that they have an opportunity, they get from, like I like to say, they get from denial to acceptance. They get out of their state of denying that this is going to happen, being upset that their talents weren't appreciated, and they pivot and they recognize, okay, this is good for us. And I often coach executives that this deal needed to happen for both sides. One company may have the dominant position, but the company is acquiring or merging because both sides needed each other. So again, going back to your example, it's always important to remember both partners needed each other. And so to make this union successful, you've got to respect what both sides bring. So once your rock star who may have stumbled gets to that point of acceptance, they can be an amazing force for good within the company. They can galvanize those people who've been on the fence, who maybe are thinking, I don't know if this deal is good, right? And as we talked about at the very beginning, the need to hold on to your talent is critical right now. I mean, you really you can't afford to lose your talent. Not only can you not afford for your rock stars to become former rock stars, you can't afford to lose your talent, period. And so once you have that type of rock star who recognizes the opportunity and pivots, leverage that, take advantage of that, have that person be front and center, because people will think that they are speaking the most truthfully of anyone else. There is always a perception that the leadership is going to be gung-ho. about the deal, right? The perception of your workforce is, well, of course they're gung-ho. They all have huge pay packages. Some of them will probably leave. I'm going to have twice as much work. That is just the nature of the beast. But when you have someone who's maybe the next level down, but had been a rock star and says, you know what, I think this deal is great. It brings us opportunity. I now see where that's going to take us. They can bring along those people who may have been on the bell curve.
You know what? I never thought of that. You know, bringing in those people to help not just sell the deal if it needs being sold, but to get everybody else on board. I never thought of that. I mean, that's incredible advice.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's because, and this is why I say the sooner I can come in and have conversations with you all and your executives, it's just how you frame, how you think about it. Because I understand you're trying to get the deal done, and executives have said to me repeatedly, having that insight helped us think about what were the moves we had to make quickly to set that integration up for success. And that's the key, because as you know, those first 100 days are critical. And your executives have likely been living with the news for a while, but your workforce and that next layer down of rock stars haven't. And so it's new news to them. So it's just a critical piece. And, you know, what I say about that scenario in particular, Alan, is you can't convert everyone. There will always be people in the workforce who say, this deal is terrible. They'll stay stuck in denial. They're the ostrich that I describe in the book. But it's those people who are rock stars, who have pivoted, who have adjusted and said, this is a good thing. I see an opportunity. Those are the ones that can really galvanize. And one of the stories that I love the most, it was a window company. And they acquired another, window company, big in the suburbs of Chicago, where I'm based. And they had someone who they thought was the rock star, was really, really important, but he ended up sapping them of a ton of energy. But there was another person who they actually didn't really think was going to be the successful leader. He was a sales leader, but he pivoted quickly. And he saw the opportunity to sell a broader portfolio of their product and quickly pivoted. And so the sales team, there were those who had said, oh, once you've lost that other guy, that's it. Our goose is cooked. But the other gentleman, because of his ability to pivot, and the rest of the sales team saw that, they said it had a huge impact on their ability to move forward and galvanize the rest of the sales force. So I just, a lot of these are watch outs, but also to recognize the power that you have when someone has been a kind of a former rock star and then corrects course, they can really help you in making the deal successful.
That's an incredibly important thing that I think, and a lot of times just gets lost in M&A deals.
Yeah, it does. It's why I have a job. And it's what we're talking about, Alan, is human nature, right? Yeah. You can't always anticipate the pandemic. I reference that all the time. Maybe you had this experience as well, right? Where people rose to the occasion. You never anticipated that. I've had so many leaders who've said to me, I was surprised by those people who stepped up and really helped lead us through some tricky times. And they said, I had people who I counted on to be my rock who really struggled. Again, it's a perfect example of what happens in that immediate post-M&A integration. It can be destabilizing for someone who's been a rock star, but someone who hasn't necessarily had that light shown on them, they can rise to the occasion and be an amazingly powerful leader.
Has the pandemic and people not being in the office and not being able to be with each other, Has the pandemic and the inability of people to interface other than through Zoom or phone calls, but not, you can't get everyone in a boardroom together anymore in a lot of situations. Has
Right.
that impacted how you're giving the advice and the advice you're giving in
Yes.
terms of dealing with this rock star issue?
Right. Well, it's interesting, and Mike Fenton and I actually had talked about this a little bit in the last keynote discussion. You're seeing different leadership styles that are required when people are faced with so much uncertainty. Your traditional leader is the person who calls the shot, they have a vision, and you go and execute. Now we're seeing it's those leaders who have greater empathy and humility and who recognize I don't have all the answers, but I think we can find the solution together. And it's a different part of a leadership toolkit. And so one of the things I've highlighted as a lesson learned from the pandemic that has applications for mergers and acquisitions is you need to look for different leadership styles during times of uncertainty. Perhaps you think the executive managed team is fantastic, right? They have a vision, they know where they're going. It's because they're doing well in a time of certainty. But when you're faced with uncertainty and in that post-deal time frame, there's a lot of uncertainty. It's a different type of leader that can rise to the occasion and can lead the team moving forward. And we saw that repeatedly during the pandemic. It was those leaders who said, listen, I don't know what's going to happen, but we need to band together to make this successful, right? And so they had humility. They brought people in, they co-created, here's what the roadmap's going to be. They didn't dictate, but it was a combination of them pulling their teams together to say, how do we navigate this? And so one of the things I highlight repeatedly with deal makers is in times of uncertainty, which that post-integration time is, it's a different leadership toolkit. So really analyze your management team for, are they may be super strong now, but how are they going to deal in times where maybe they don't have all the answers, right? Could they weather that? And then you need to be crystal clear on how about that next line down? Are they able to handle a scenario where maybe things change repeatedly, right? The competitor comes out with a market sooner than everyone anticipated, or a new government policy comes down. So I say you can't just evaluate the management team, because times are good. That's why you're acquiring them, or that's why you're considering them, right? They're doing gangbusters. How will they do in times of uncertainty when the market may change and they're trying to now combine, two separate companies? So to your point, it's really that evaluation is important. Secondly, with the question of remote work, the leaders who I've seen be most successful are the ones who are showing an understanding for the situation that people are in, who showed, who actually went into action, didn't just show empathy and compassion, but called people up, reached out, said, how are you doing? I understand you have, 2 kids, and I understand also your mom's sick, but who really demonstrated a deeper understanding of what people were going through. Those are the leaders who were most successful in this, I can't say post-pandemic because we're still in it, but in the early struggles. The same thing applies to that post-integration timeframe, right? It's those leaders who are saying, listen, this is a new strategy we are pursuing. We need to let go of the old way of doing things, but together, working with other teams, we can make this possible. But it's coming in with humility and more humility and less ego.
So now I'm going to get to the question that most intrigues me and is probably most relevant to me. If I'm having lunch, dinner, whatever it is, or otherwise talking to deal makers, what should I be telling them in terms of dealing with rock stars?
Well, unfortunately, I think it's almost kind of a summary. We've kind of touched on it in multiple ways, right? And you highlighted, which I think is fabulous, what your initial perception of a rock star was, right? That, hey, those are the people, the rainmakers in the company, don't lose them. So the advice I would say is Those aren't the only rock stars you need to be mindful of. And don't just put all of your energy against those people. The two other aspects of Rockstar that we covered and I think is critical for deal makers to keep in mind is those people who did really well, right? You're keeping them, but then they struggle and you're seeing them not do well. You can waste a lot of energy and time trying to figure out, okay, what do we need to do? Look for those people who can rise to the occasion, those people who are rock stars that have the opportunity to play a larger role. And when trying to help those people who were your rock stars, I always say, acknowledge the success they had in the past, but emphasize the need to pivot and contribute to the future, to be part of contributing to the new way of doing things, because it's always going to be a new strategy. In that M&A post-deal timeframe, a new strategy is established. You've got two companies coming together, whether it's a product, a service, or solution. They're coming together to create something new. And so for how you help that former rock star, it's acknowledging, listen, you were fabulous at what you've done. Now we need to take that energy and move it towards a new strategy and new objectives. Because if you aren't identifying what those new metrics for success are and you aren't embracing them, you can struggle. So for deal makers, really the key most important thing is to understand the different aspects of a rock star, and that it's not just the one person who needs to be held on to. It can manifest in a number of ways, and it's critical to identify that early on. One CEO said to me, and I appreciated this, again, it's in my book. One of the greatest lessons learned was he'd spent so much time focused on this person that he hadn't appreciated the introverts in the organization. He said, I actually, the quiet people, right, who were not the first ones, the people who are in your face are the ones you tend to listen to. But he said, I made sure in future efforts that I actually sought out the people who weren't talking in the meetings, right? The people who were holding back, who clearly had a point of view. And he said 9 times out of 10, they completely reframed how I was thinking of things and how we needed to move forward. So, it's the education is how you define a rock star and where you put your energy. Don't just assume it's always one type of person that can be a significant leader in your organization in that post-integration timeframe.
There's something that comes to mind now that I think people are becoming more aware of what you're dealing with and what you're the expert on. When I started practicing, if I had a client was selling out and they were going to stay on with the buyer, I used to have a standard bet that I don't care how long your employment contract is. If you're still there in 12 months, we will go to the restaurant of your choice, my spouse and yours, and I will pay. And for the first 30 years, I never had to pay. Well, what happened is, people would go and all of a sudden they're not the boss anymore.
Right.
Employees who were good to them, they don't have to be good to them anymore.
Right.
And they're not used to somebody else making decisions that they may not agree with, but they paid X $100 million for your company, they can decide. And it was almost impossible to integrate those people. In the last couple of years, I've stopped making that bet because it was starting to cost me a lot of money. And so the world seems to have evolved in your direction in terms of looking into and dealing with these things.
Right. And I think, it's why I so appreciate ACG Toronto hosting this discussion, because it's making people aware of this reality. They're not unexpected people challenges. You can't expect them. So how to be smart and how to be prepared for them so that you can actually set the deal up for success. Because really, at the end of the day, that's what it's about.
Well, I have to thank you because I really, really enjoyed this.
Super. It was a pleasure as well.
Great. Well, Alan and Jennifer, thank you for that conversation. I learned a lot more, even more than the first time that we had you on, Jennifer. It's really interesting that we're here now, having hosted this conference for the second time online, and that we're now 18 months plus into the lockdown, but heading back to live where we're starting to get out and meet people again and travel. There's some business travel going on. But it's interesting to see, I think, as you both commented, how this challenge has turned into even more of an opportunity and can be more of a strategic advantage for the companies that realize they have to address this sooner rather than later, and they have to address it in a formal way. And to your point, yes, it's created or expanded your business. I wonder, Jennifer, if you could think back to 18 to 24 months ago when you were starting down this path, not knowing there was going to be a pandemic, but I've got to believe it's probably expanded or opened doors that may not have been there or may not have been there within the last 2 years, just because of the nature of the challenges that companies are facing. Would that be true?
Absolutely. I think the pandemic just accelerated the direction we were already going in. And
Right.
Mike and I talked, before the pandemic about this topic. And so what I've seen, though, is because, the consequences of what we've all been dealing with globally, there is an increasing focus on the people piece. And as an Alan and I discussed, you can't afford to lose talent right now because people are reevaluating what they want to do at work. And in that post-deal timeframe, you've got to hold on to those people. So in that regard, my business is doing well because people want to know what do we need to do in order to hold the talent that will be critical. And this discussion just highlights your talent aren't just the ones that you think are shiny objects. Right.
No, that's something that we've been having discussions with all of our members, and I think Alan, you've mentioned it as well. The challenge to retain talent, not even find new talent, but retain talent, is becoming a bigger issue. Not just around M&A deals in general, but just in general, it's becoming a bigger challenge. So,
Mike, the other thing that I would say, in addition to that question, is those deal makers who are using that focus on the people piece, they can use that as a competitive advantage.
Sure.
Those private equity who recognize this is important. And the more I talk about, not just give it lip service, but actively. And that's where I feel like I've had some opportunities to partner with private equity deal makers who are recognizing that part.
Excellent. And Alan, thank you for moderating us through that. I'm sure that it sounded like there were a couple of points where you said, you obviously said there were a couple of aha moments for you that you'll probably take some of this away for your for your work moving forward as well. That's great. Well, listen, thanks to both of you for joining us today. Just want to let our audience know that there will be a recording link available of this conversation, which I'm sure you're going to want to share with your management teams and your staff teams in the future. After the conference, we will be sharing copies of all of the recordings, and this one included, as well as an attendee list. So you can expect to get an email from us probably within the next probably 10 to 14 work days. If you have any other questions or you would like to contact either of our speakers, please let us know. And we do have a special offer that I was going to mention on behalf of Jennifer, an excerpt from her book, including the chapter on rock stars. Jennifer, why don't you we'll put the QR code up in a minute. Why don't you just do the promotion, because you know it better than I do?
Well, what I get asked about a lot are the characters. And so the QR code, all you have to do is snap the QR code and it'll give you access to sections of my book that talk about that. Obviously, I'd love for you to order the book. It's available globally. And but I know sometimes people just want to read certain chapters. The Fast Company article stems from how I talk about the rock star in the book. Right.
That's great. And we'll make sure that we get that information on the video and out to probably when we send out our post event information to the audience. We can let them know about that as well. So listen, thank you to Alan. Thanks to Dickinson Wright for hosting, moderating, sponsoring, and Jennifer, thanks to you for coming back and joining us. At one point, we will meet in person, and maybe that'll be early in the new year. We'll see. But thanks for a really interesting conversation. We really appreciate it. We know it's going to be a popular session.